Bruchim Aboyim, we are now in the second part of our lecture on the portion in the fifth book of the Torah, in Devarim, Deuteronomy. We are on the fourth of the portions, Reeh, and we are also on the fourth lecture. We are up to chapter 12, verse number 18. Moshe is talking to the nation here about them being able to partake of meat, again, that is not sacrificial. So, again, when it comes to sacrificial things, they would have to be brought to the temple, which he will say. And otherwise, again, we'll talk about this whole idea of eating meat. So again, verse number 18. So Moshe tells them where to bring a sacrifice. Kiyam lifnei Hashem Elokecha tochlena. But only for God, the Lord your God, shall eat it. B'makom, in a place yivchar Hashem Elokecha bo, that the Lord God will choose. Ato vincha v'itecha, you and your son and your daughter, and the avdecha masecha, and your male servant and female servant. V'alevi asher b'sharecha, and also the Levite that is in your gate. Now, Rashi here tells us that this should be done lifnei Hashem. So this is talking, we mentioned, at this point, the Jewish nation did not know where the temple would be built. So even though we know it's in Jerusalem, but at this point it had not been identified as the site of the temple. Again, they will spend, when they come into the land, the temple at the tabernacle at Shiloh will stand for 369 years. It'll be a total of 440 years before they actually build, so Shlomo will build the first temple. But if you're going to eat a sacrifice, it should be before God. So whenever a person eats, whatever a person eats, should be for the sake of God and not to satisfy his desires. Again, we believe that a person should eat to live to eat, that other way around. Eat to live and not live to eat. Again, being Jewish, we have it backwards. Probably because we go from right to left. Anyways, and it says, V'alevi asher b'sharecha. It mentions the Levite with your family. So Rashi here tells us, Im ein lecha laseis mechelko, if you do not have enough to give him of his portion. Now we know that the system of tithing was the first gift that was given from the produce of a field was called truma. Tarum, something was lifted, would be given to the Kohen. Again, there were less Kohanim than Levium. 2% was the basic amount. Then 10% next was given, it's called Meiser Rishon, that would be given to the Levites. And they would give from there 10% to the priests. So if he does not have enough in his portion to what he needs, again from the first tithing, then there's Meiser Ani, there is the tithing for the poor. So you give him from the tithing of the poor, and if you have no tithing for the poor, invite him to your peace offering. Means share your bounty with him. Now, the question becomes why is Moshe for God telling us specifically about the Levite? Why is that mentioned? Now, it may be an allusion to the fact that during the first temple era, during the time of David HaMelech and Shlomo, again, the nation was united, all 12 tribes. But when Shlomo died, his son Rehoboam took over, and that brought about a split in what we call Malchus Yehuda and Malchus Yisrael, between Yerovam ben Nevat, who was a great man, again, who amazingly was able to pull away the 10 tribes and start what we call the kingdom of Israel. And since he did not want to share his power with in the temple, he put up 2 temples, one in Dan and one in Beisel. And he put in golden calves. He was able to find new holidays in the Torah. So the Levites that were in the 10 tribes, because again we know that the cities, they were given 48 cities that were spread out among the 12 tribes. Those Levites that were living within the 10 tribes that Yerovam had taken over were forced to leave, because what Yerovam did is he closed the border so that people could not go to the temple. So all of the Levites had to move within the two tribes of Yehuda and Binyamin, which were the only two tribes that stayed with Rechavam, the son of Shlomo. The problem was that the tithings were supposed to be done by all 12 tribes. Now you had two tribes supporting that which 12 tribes were to support for the Levites, which put them in a state of poverty, basically. Now, when the first temple was destroyed and the nation was exiled to Babylon, during those 70 years that they were there, they actually were able to make a living themselves. They did not have to live in a state of poverty anymore. In fact, when Ezra came back to build the second temple, the Levites, most of them stayed in Bavel, in Babylon. And in fact, what Ezra did is he took the first tithing and gave it to the Kohanim, who did come back. And again, the Levites did not want to come back. Why live in a state of poverty? And they were willing to send money, but they did not want to continue to live in the way they had before. So this may be why the Torah specifies, again, that we should have special care for the Levite, because they would be in that position of poverty by virtue of what would happen. Now, it said, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God and all that you put your hand onto. Again, a blessing that you'll be successful. In verse 19, it continues, guide yourself, pendazov Levi, least you will forsake the Levite, call Yemech as long as you live, ala masecha, on your land. Now, this is an allusion. Again, who were the Levites? The Levites were those that taught the people. After all, that they would only have to serve a minimal amount of time in the temple, 2 weeks plus the holidays. So the rest of the time was spent for them being amongst the people. Again, as they had given the 48 cities, so they would be among the people. And they became the teachers. So just like it's a mitzvah to support the Levites, from here we also understand that it's a mitzvah to support those who study Torah, those that teach, those that help us to fulfill our obligations before the Lord God. Now, also not to say that the Levites are lazy and unproductive part of society. Also to those who learn and teach, based on Rishin Shavel Hirsch. People, many times, there are people who take advantage of situation. They go to Kollel, they learn, and they really don't learn. But if a person is dedicated and does what God expects of him, then the truth is, for us to support a person like that is an honor and a privilege. They too have a purpose. To say that someone is learning and they're being lazy, which is not the case. We call it a melim b'Torah. A person needs to toil in Torah. So if a person is dedicated, a person dedicates himself to God and serving God, then it's really a bracha to be able to help them and support them. We see that the two brothers, Yisachar and Zvulun, had that type of relationship. Zvulun were the businessmen, the merchants. They traveled to seas. And Yisachar were the heads of the high supreme court. They were the learners. And the two brothers made a deal whereby Zvulun supported Yisachar. And they shared both in their physical lives, so to speak, in the money that Zvulun made, and also in the merit of them being able to Yisachar being able to learn Torah and share in that reward as well. The Torah is called Eitz Chaim Hi, a tree of life. Not for those that learn it, but those that support it. The truth of the matter is that we see that a person who supports learning and its institutions is even greater than a person who learns. Basic reason being that when a person supports someone, if you support someone, pay someone to learn for an hour, you get the reward for an hour. They have to spend that hour learning. If they're late or they schmooze or do whatever and they don't fulfill their obligation, then they've missed it. But you get the reward for the hour. Women are not really required to learn Torah. They do have to know the laws of what they do. Today things are a little bit different. But when a woman sends her child to school and her husband to a lecture, she gets full reward. What he does or what the child does may be different, but her reward may even be greater. The one who supports it, the one that keeps it, may even be greater than the one who learns. Also, this command is only true in the land of Israel, where the nation of Israel had land and the Levites did not. But when it comes to being outside of Eretz Yisrael, as we are today in the exile, then all people are equal. Again, depending upon what they do. So a Levite can be someone who works. He can be someone who learns, each one individually. And it continues, says, Al Mosecha, on your land, Rashi says, Al Bagola Eina Mosalo. Again, as it mentions that in exile you don't have to watch him the same way, more than anyone else, meaning to say that any Jew that needs, whether he's a Levite, an Israelite, would make no difference. He still should be helped. Again, we help a brother. And it continues in verse number 20, which connects to this end on your land, that Ki Yarkav Hashem Elokecha es Gevulcha, that God will, when he enlarges your borders. What does that mean? Rashi tells us, the Torah teaches us proper conduct. Okay? That it says, Kasher Diba Lach V'Amarta, as I've told you and said, Ochla Basar, you want to eat meat. Kitava Nafshka Lechol Basar, because a person has a desire to eat meat. B'chol Avas Nafshka Basar, and on all of your desires of the soul, you may eat meat. Rashi tells us the proper conduct is, though, the only time a person should eat meat is when he lives in abundance and wealth, based on Gemara and Chulin. Yeah, the Torah is really very astute. You know, the key to wealth, the key to life is money management. Live within your own means. One of the problems that people have is they live above their means. And then when something hits like this pandemic, all of a sudden, you know, they're left without anything because they have extended themselves so far. There's a saying in the Gemara that's Sonei Daran, that a person should hate gifts. It says so much so that a person should make Shabbos a weekday and eat the same way as he does on the weekday rather than taking gifts from others. Again, everything has a price that goes with it. So a person should try to live within their means, and a person will be much happier. You know, I had a friend that was making a great deal of money. Problem was he was spending more money than he made. So it makes no difference how much you make. The real key becomes how much you spend. Also, if you give the Levi, God will enlarge your borders, and you will be blessed, again, for this mitzvah. Not only the Levi, again, we can extend it to, again, today, to supporting sages and Torah institutions. Also, Rabbeinu Bachai says from this verse, we learn that only wealthy people should eat meat, again, as we've mentioned before. Now, it would seem that permission to eat meat in Eretz Yisrael was dependent on how far one lived from the temple. However, the Ramban states this is not to be understood as physical distance. The term means that when the nation of Israel, instead of living next to the tabernacle, as they did for 40 years in the desert, would be now scattered throughout the land of Israel, it would not be practical for them to come to Jerusalem, to the temple, every time they wanted to eat meat based on a tour. So again, if it's not a sacrifice, then they would be allowed to eat it anywhere. When we talk to Ochla Basar, about eating meat, because again, that's what a person desires, the Orach Chaim says from here we see that after the land was conquered, they were permitted to eat meat, and that meant other than the shlomim. Because again, when they were in the desert, if they wanted to eat meat, they had to bring a sacrifice at the tabernacle. Again, we mentioned last week that the shlomim is a peace offering, where the majority of the meat would go to the owner of the animal. Then a portion, again, the foreleg and the chest would go to the Kohen, and the innards and the blood and whatever will go to God. So it was something that was brought peace. God received his portion, the Kohen received his portion, and the owner received his. Again, so it's called a peace offering. Again, everybody, so to speak, got a piece. And also, Rabbi Akiva learns from here that now they had to follow the laws of ritual slaughtering in order to eat meat once they were entering the land here. Also, the Ikri Karim states that Cain, it's an interesting thought that man was no better than any creature, any animal. So he brought a sacrifice from the land. He brought flax. Hevel, on the other hand, knew that man was superior to animals and rules over them. So, and God agreed with Hevel. So before the flood, the people agreed with Cain and sunk to the level of animals. So that after the flood, God allowed Noah to eat meat. One of the reasons being to signify that man was now clearly superior to animals. The Barbanel says that Adam was forbidden to eat meat because of his high spiritual level. After man had fallen, Noah was now, after the flood, was allowed to eat meat, which cultivates cruelty and materialism. This is much like a doctor who has given up on a patient, and now he allows that, and again, since man's constitution had weakened during that year in the ark, and much like a doctor who has given up, allows man to eat, on occasion, allows him to eat meat. But for Jews, the only type of meat which is allowed to be eaten would be those animals that are domesticated and limit their animalistic tendencies based on the Nakshoni. Now it says in Rashi also said, "B'kol avos nafshel," your soul desired. So Rashi tells, but in the wilderness, again, they were forbidden to eat regular meat, ordinary meat, unless they, again, as I mentioned, unless they brought it as a sacrifice to God. Now, in verse 21, it continues and it says, "Ki yirkat meha makam," if the place is too far from you, asher yivkar Shem Elokecha l'sum shmo sham, God has chosen to put his name there. Again, hamakam, the place. There's no mention of Jerusalem. Okay, up until this point. There are different reasons given as to why it was not. Reasons that the Gentile nations would defile it. The tribes themselves would have a war between themselves as to who would be the owner of that land. So again, it was something in the end that was owned by no one, and King David, as I mentioned last time, was able to buy it, and by taking money from the 12 tribes and buying it with that money. Also, this is alluding to the spiritual level, that even if you live physically in Jerusalem itself, again, that would mean if you're far, you can be close to it physically, but spiritually be a distance from it. Also, the reason why you have strong physical desires is because you have distanced yourself from God. That if a person feels truly spiritual, his desires are God's desires. They're one and the same, and there's no contradiction. And then you will bring a sacrifice, you will slaughter from your own cattle and sheep, which God has given to you, as I have commanded you. And you will eat in your gates, not in the temple, all that your soul desires. Now, Rashi here tells us that this teaches us that there is a commandment regarding slaughtering. The Torah does not clearly state what it is, what ritual slaughtering is about. Again, we see here that these are laws which were told to Moshe and Har Sinai. So what we have is we have Torah laws that are directly stated in the Torah. We also have rabbinic laws. In between, we have something called Halakha Moshe Misinai, which are laws that were given to Moshe on Mount Sinai. Now, again, these are Torahic, and one of those laws are all of the laws that deal with ritual slaughtering. There's a whole debate as to whether ritual slaughtering is humane. Many nations have tried to outlaw shechita, ritual slaughtering. But one should know that there is probably no other way of killing an animal that is more humane than shechita. It has to be done with a knife. Again, let's wait a minute now. We'll go over some of the laws as what it has to be in a couple of verses in a second. And it says also, nowhere in Torah again does it tell what shechita are. Again, we learn it out. Moshe Misan of these laws also. They tell the story of Rav Nachman Chernobyl, that he came to a town, and what he would do when he came to a town, all towns, he would check to make sure that the ritual slaughterer that they had, the shochet, he would check his knife to make sure that it was without a blemish. He cannot have a nick. It's like a scalpel. It has to be razor sharp. So when he came, he told the shochet that he wanted to check his knife, and that he had something to take care of, and that he would stop by later. Shochet went home, took out his knife, and he thought to himself, maybe he should sharpen it again, just to make sure it was pristine. But then he thought to himself, if someone brought an animal, would he use that knife as it is right now? And he said yes to himself. So he decided that he was not going to touch the knife. That when Nachum Chimmel came to check the knife, he would check the knife as it is, because he always kept his knife pristine. So he didn't do anything to it. When Nachum Chernobyl came, he presented the knife to him, and Reb Nachum said to him, if it's good enough for God, it's good enough for me. So since he did not want to check it because he knew it was right, but somehow the rabbi knew that as well. Again, this becomes the point that we need to always make sure that what we do is good for God, not just for people. Also from the words, Kasher tzivisicha, as I have commanded you, the sages agree with the Ramban, Nachmanides, that we must slaughter non-sacrificial animals in the same manner as sacrificial animals, based on Ramban. So there's no distinction between how an animal would be slaughtered, killed in the temple or outside the temple. That the laws of shechita, of slaughtering an animal, are exactly the same. And it continues in verse number 22. And it says, Ach kasher yochel es hatzvi v'sa'ayel. But just like you would eat a deer or a hart, kain tochlena hatamim v'ator yakto v'tochlena. So you should eat the unclean and clean. Again, you should eat the same way. Now, Rashi tells when we ach, you are forewarned to eat them in a state of purity. If so, then, as the fat of the gazelle and the hart is permissible, so should the fat of ordinary animals also be permissible. But the Torah tells us, ach, which comes to limit something, that when it comes to kosher animals that are brought up, domesticated animals, there are 3 of those. That is the cow family, ox, sheep, and goats. That's it. Those are the 3 animals. There are 7 other kosher animals that are wild animals. Again, and with them, the laws are a little bit different, not as far as shechita is concerned, but as far as eating the fats of that animal and giving it to the priest. Now, the word ach, I'm ahead of myself. So, again, so we talked with Rashi. Let's go to verse number 23, and now we'll bring the whole conversation full circle. Rak chazak levilti ochel hadam. Now, the Torah brings a prohibition, a very strict prohibition against eating blood. This prohibition is very strong. In fact, so much so, for example, even your own blood. Let's say you take a bite out of an apple, and when you pull away, you notice that there's blood, that somehow your gums bled, and it's on the apple. Well, guess what? You have to cut that away. You cannot eat your own blood. People have a tendency, they'll cut themselves. The first thing you do is they put it in their mouth. You can't do that. That would be a Torah prohibition. You cannot even take your own blood, let alone any animal's blood. So, Rakazel levildi ochel, one person should be strong not to eat blood. Ki adam hu hanafish. This is the important part, because the blood is the soul. We believe that the soul is within the blood. That is the life force of a person. Lo sochal nefesh. In a basar, a person should not eat the life with the meat, is what the verse tells us. Now, Rashi here tells us from these words, again, chazak, a person should be strong. We can derive that they were, again, that they were desolate in the eating of the blood. Consequently, it was necessary to be steadfast. Now, there's an opinion by Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon ben Azai says, the Torah comes only to admonish you, to teach you of what extent you are required to fulfill this commandment. It's an interesting thing Rashi tells us, that if regard to blood, from which it is easy to guard oneself, since no one has a desire for it, it was necessary to urge you strongly concerning its prohibition. How much more so does it apply to other commandments of the Torah that a person would normally want? Now we'll see that there'll be opinions going back and forth as far as their desire for blood and not. Now, when it says rock, the word rock comes to exclude the liver which we may eat. Now, when one cooks the liver, again, you have to let the blood drip. Generally, a liver is cooked a little bit differently. You want to make sure that all the blood drains out of it. Again, we know that we salt meat. The reason we salt the meat is so that we draw the blood out. In fact, interestingly enough, I haven't been religious my whole life. I remember being irreligious and going to the supermarket and buying, a sirloin steak, something expensive and a good piece of meat. But it was never good as kosher meat. And the reason why people buy kosher meat and they don't realize it, kosher meat is salted. And because it's salted, it brings out the taste. It tastes better. If for no other reason, it's that the salt makes it better. Now the prohibition against eating blood is found 7 times in the Torah. The prohibition against working on the Shabbat is found 12 times in the Torah. And the mention of the Exodus from Egypt is mentioned no less than 50 times in the Torah. These things that Torah sees as fundamental to our Judaism are repeated again and again, based on Rabbeinu Bachai. Now, the fact that Torah mentions not eating blood 7 times tells us that in Egypt, the nation of Israel were deeply steeped in eating and using blood for the service of idols based on a Torah. Again, many times in idolatrous cultures, they saw blood as, again, the soul, and they tried to ingest it within them. There were those cultures that had a custom of, when they would kill a person even, they would cut out the heart and eat the heart, again, to take that person's strength. Now, the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu had to warn the nation against not eating blood from non-consecrated animals was because the Torah spelled out that the prohibition against blood, the Torah states in Vayikra, I have reserved the blood to serve you as an atonement on the altar. That's what the blood was done. Again, it was either sprinkled or burnt on the altar. I might have thought that the prohibition to eat blood applies only to blood that can serve as an atonement, and that therefore blood from a non-consecrated animal, which does not go on the altar, would be permitted. So therefore it's very clearly stated that it should not be done that way. Also, the Ramban gives another reason for the repeating of the prohibition of eating blood here. And he says because the nation of Israel at this time were avidly desirous of blood, and that is why they were told in verse 23 to be strong, about avoiding eating blood, and were promised great reward for doing so. Also, we see the Torah found it necessary to repeat the prohibition of blood, even though it did not mention the prohibition of chalev. Again, the forbidden fats also that a person have. Now, the blood and the fats deal with enthusiasm and laziness. Again, the blood is something that boils, something a person is hot-blooded, is what we say. And again, fat usually comes when a person is overindulgent and lazy. So both of these go against, again, what God in the Torah wants us to do and be. Now, one of the laws of shechita, of slaughtering ritually, is for the blood to be poured on the ground and covered. Again, earth represents humility, which is a key to rectifying one's soul, based on Reb Nachman of Breslov. Now, Reb Nachman says also there are 5 prohibitive acts regarding shechita, ritual slaughtering, which correspond to the 5 books of the Torah. The act of shechita is akin to rectifying souls, much like the Torah helps a person rectify his own soul. So there are 5 requirements when a person slaughters an animal. Number 1, that you cannot pause. When they start the act of shechita, when you begin to cut into the animal's throat, you cannot stop. It has to be done in a continuous stroke. Also, you can't chop it. It has to be drawn. Again, chopping of the trachea and the esophagus is not permitted. Again, in order for shechita to be valid, with a bird, you only have to cut one of the signs, either the trachea or the esophagus. With an animal, you have to cut the majority of both the trachea and the esophagus. Also, you cannot stab the animal with a knife. Conceal the knife within the neck of the animal. It has to go along the neck. And again, it's also, you cannot cut outside the area, again, that is proper for the shechita. And also that a person cannot tear. You can't rip it. So all of these things are done, again, to make the animal feel as little pain as possible. Again, Tsar Balei Chayim, giving pain to anything but an animal is considered to be a sin. There is an amazing thing when you study Torah and you study the physical makeup of things. We see how right on the Torah is with all that it tells us. It seems that in a kosher animal, between the esophagus and the trachea, there is something called the carotid artery. This artery runs between the trachea and the esophagus only in kosher animals. In non-kosher animals, that same artery runs along the back of the animal by the spine. So it's interesting that there were 6 laws given to Adam of life on how to live. We say there are 7 Noahide laws. There was a 7th given to Noah after the flood, and that law was called Aver Min Achai, taking a limb from a live animal. Now, this is not really a Jewish law. It's one that's been part of the Noahide laws. So, for example, where there's an old thing of a chicken with its head cut off and running around. Again, that's a muscle reaction. Once an animal is shechted properly, even if it's moving, if the shechita is proper, you can take a limb from that animal. Why? Because the animal is dead, but it's moving. And the answer is because when you cut the trachea and the esophagus, you automatically cut that artery, the carotid artery. So there's no longer any blood that goes to the brain, which means the animal can feel nothing. If you did shechita to a non-kosher animal, a pig, for example, and you slaughtered it with a shochet's knife, and it's razor sharp, and again, if it's razor sharp, the animal doesn't feel a thing. What the animal feels is air. Same thing even at a bris, when you hear the baby crying at a circumcision, more often than not, the baby's crying when they take the diaper off. That the baby really does not feel, because it's a scalpel, it's razor sharp. So when the shochet cuts the animal, what he does is cuts the brain, probably blood to the brain, therefore the animal feels nothing. When a non-kosher animal is killed, then the artery has not been cut, so therefore it will feel pain. So until that animal stops moving, we believe the animal is still alive, and that would be a prohibition for a non-Jew. Whereas for a Jew and a kosher animal, a sheep, a goat, or a cow of sorts, again, once the shechita is done, the animal is considered dead and has no feeling in any way, shape, or form. We see how right on the Torah is in all that it tells us. Wow. It amazes me how quick time flies. Lo sochal nefesh, im a basar, a person should not eat the thing with the flesh with the soak, im a basar. Why? Because we say that eating meat in such a cruel fashion will bring out the trait of cruelty within the person eating it. Again, you are what you eat. So when a person eats something that has cruelty to it, it also comes to that person. So this becomes a warning, again, not to take a limb from a live animal. I think we're going to stop here. It amazes me how time just moves. Next week we'll continue with the same theme of shechita and eating, again, things that are mundane, not just things that are holy. I want to thank you very much for coming. God bless, be well. May wish you all, your family should be happy and safe and healthy. And Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for attending.